Oh, so I'm Parminder, Bhachu. I teach in the Sociology department. I think we're supposed to introduce ourselves. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to talk in three parts. I firstly want to tell you about my reaction before seeing the film and after seeing the film. And secondly, I want to talk about the notion of immigrant capital versus transnational elite capital, which is fluid, which is liquid, and which flows with enormous ease. I mean, that doesn't mean people who are from immigrant backgrounds don't have those skills as well. And thirdly, I want to talk about a personal experience which is very related to what happens in the film, what engaged my imagination. So when I heard of this film, Crazy Rich Asians, I thought this is not a good idea, because I think that it is actually, it worries me a little bit when people talk about rich Asians. You know, I'm from England, Britain I should say, and my experiences are when Asians, British black people are rich, they're very few, but lots of wealthy Asians. It's very troubling for many people who are locally based. So, you know, London has many transnational elites, Russian oligarchs, people from Qatar, you know, many Indian billionaires now. I mean, India has so many billionaires, and they have very expensive properties in posh London. But they're not locals. They don't mix with the locals. Some of these places are empty. But if you're in the local scene, you see, even in very liberal circuits, when Asian wealth is displayed, it is very problematic. So I quite like the idea of the Wakanda economy, you know, in Black Panther, where it's powerful, it's technically sophisticated, there's supreme level of resources, but it is underground, it's hidden, it's sub rosa, and so on and so forth. So I thought, so this is my sort of general feeling about it. So having seen the film, there are things that I find really interesting. I don't, you know, some of my friends thought it was sort of comedic fluffiness, but I did not, I engaged with it in a way that I found really interesting. And the interesting thing for me is the notion of transnational capital and the notion of immigrant capital, which Rachel Chu carries, as opposed to Nicholas Young, who is from the sign of a very powerful, generationally deep a family which has social capital, which has financial resources, economic resources, and vast networks, and also multi-sited economic property capital, etc. So that is what I found really interesting. And this is why I think that this, it's interesting for me, that this young man is interested in a woman who is an immigrant, a high-achieving immigrant from a background where it's not buttressed by either mainstream resources, in terms of being buttressed by, you know, powerful families, etc. And then there is also a mother who has a past which is completely, you know, rejected by Singaporean families of a certain class group. So I think that for me the alliances of that capital is really interesting. So she goes back to Singapore with him, and it's you see in the film that she doesn't really understand the dress codes of that very wealthy elite. I mean, she that subculture is not something that she's probably interested in, and she does not read it very well. But equally, as you see in the case of you know, she's rejected by the mother and by these eminent families who have very suitable daughters, which are part of the same subcultural group. And you see that she's not quite acceptable by the mother. She has no local status, you know, there's no discernible economic capital, a flaw in her mother's story, you know, in a way, a most unsuitable match. And her academic credentials carry no weight in a domain which is determined by very high levels of conspicuous consumption, and what is valued is wealth, and also social status and preeminence through depth of connections, through status which is durable, which has been passed through. And she is not part of that. But what is interesting about her, the mother is not able to decode that at all. And she rejects her. You remember at the beginning of the film when she's introduced, the mother has a back to her many times, and then there's an event that's a complete rupture when they find out about her background, etc. And then what was very significant to me was the ways in which Rachel as a carrier, she's an economics professor, she is smart, she's made it on her own, that the mahjong game was really significant to me in the way in which it revealed her power and her ability to deal with that situation on her own terms. And remember that she had the winning tile, but she does not use it. She already has won in the sense that she has the proposal of marriage from this person, and she has turned it down, but we'll find that out later on. And she has the winning tile, but she does not use it. And so I read that as her display, of not only generosity, of telling the mother that she's rejecting the son, but also allowing the mother to win. And then you see her tiles, and she has won. She has the winning tile. And I thought that was the lack of arrogance and a generosity on her part as immigrant, and as somebody who had already the thing that the mother valued, and it's the mother then understands her. But this is something that happens so often in so many of these domains, where they're immigrants who are self-made, and then there are people who are already come from very wealthy backgrounds, which is combined with social status and so on and so forth. I found that confrontation really interesting, and it revealed what these two women carried, and in a way Rachel wins with her style, which is low-key, which is not arrogant, but which is there, and the mother cannot read it. And so the third thing I wanted to talk about was a personal experience, which is very similar. Am I nearly done with my 5 minutes? I think I've got 2 more. I don't think I'm supposed to be 5. So I wanted to talk about a third thing. So I for myself come from an immigrant background, and these are diasporics who've been away from India for 120 years. And I had a very similar experience to Rachel in my pre-Clark, pre-Worcester days, when I was fashionable into clothes and books in my 20s. There was a very young, wealthy Sikh guy who was very interested in me, and these people were connected. Were friends of Margaret Thatcher, connected with the nobility, had houses in the center of London and now houses in France. And so one day I was not interested in this guy, but I liked what he did. He had this very sweet sports car, an apartment in the middle of London, and those are things I quite enjoyed. He did very interesting cultural things. So I'm invited to their house, and the first thing his mother says to me, and this is posh London, just a little bit further from Mayfair, that area. And so she tells me, are you the one who's done a PhD? This is the first thing she says to me. And I say, yes, I've done. And then I wanted to learn the Punjabi script, which I read, but not fluently. She said, you won't be able to do it. And then she tells me, I don't know what these East African Asians think they are. They did not own a single acre of land in India. And here they are. They think that this, that, the other, because East African Asians dominate the professions, the cultural production, and so on and so forth. And I too am a daughter of a widow, I have siblings, and I was an academic. So all these things were very significant to me. And what is really significant is the way in which transnational elites are both, of course there's the issues of class that play into this, but immigrants carry a capital which transnational elites cannot read. And if you are in Singapore, where you're completely an immigrant amongst these very established, who have moved all over the world but have very powerful local base, as opposed to a woman who is a New Yorker but doesn't have that level of social capital. So those are my 3 things. That there was I had a pre-film reaction. I thought that people should not display their wealth, just as Jewish bankers, investment bankers, as opposed to Yankee houses here. They were able to have banks, but you could not always think of them as Jewish banks. And there's very good reasons for why you need to do that. If you're in England, you see this on a daily basis, that carrying wealth is very problematic for many local British people. Secondly, I wanted to talk about the transnational versus immigrant wealth. Thirdly, personal experience, which is related to the film, which made me engage with the film in a particular kind of way. And so I did not read it as fluff. I read it as very interesting in the dynamics it explores, which I find interesting from an immigrant point of view. High-achieving immigrants who carry a certain capital, which transnational elites do not read well and actually do not want to read it. So that's my 5 minutes.
So 5 minutes. I actually didn't think that was going to be long enough for me, but I will keep it to 5, I promise. My name is Maria Gallant, and I am the assistant in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'm going to self-proclaim myself as the uber fan of this movie on this panel, because you might judge me, but I've seen the movie 5 times. And paid full price each time. I didn't go matinee at all. I am a US-born Filipino-American who grew south of the Mason-Dixon and grew up in a place which was mainly white space. It was old farm tobacco land and has a history of slavery, and honestly it's kind of weird to think about growing up, but I grew up with African American students who were, if you look back far enough, were owned by the white families in the area. So my actual experience with racial identity as an Asian American was I was one of 2 people in my entire class, well, not to count excluding my brothers and other relatives who might have been in the space. So growing up, I am a huge pop culture junkie, and I love watching rom-coms and watching movies, TV, and all that nonsense, even reality TV. But it was very rare to grow up and see an entirely Asian cast in anything, unless you were waiting for independent films, and I didn't discover those until I was in college. So for me, watching this movie, I was lucky enough to go to a screening a week before it opened, and I sat there with my husband, who happens to be white, and I didn't realize what was going to come over me when I sat there. I went to go watch Black Panther because I was excited when that came out, and I was excited for my friends who really felt that movie, and I was like, yes, and I've shared this experience with everybody, with others. I said, I get what you're feeling. And then I sat in that screening and went, no, now I really get what you're feeling. I love romantic comedies, and I grew up having crushes on Tom Cruise, Ben Affleck, Matthew McConaughey. Those were the guys that I fell in love with in romantic comedies. Now I'm watching an entire cast and going, wow, so this is what it feels like to just see people like me there. So the experience was just really kind of a little overwhelming, had no idea how to describe it, but I just sat there and was like, wow. I cried and laughed at all the appropriate parts, but for me, it was extremely, extremely exciting. And I sat there with a big grin on my face. I left the movie with a huge grin on my face going, yay! Now, there are a lot of things that you can still be critical about this movie, but for me, it was it's an entire cast of people who look like me. I'm going to keep saying that because that's a huge thing, and I did not know that it was a huge thing. That's, I think, the bigger thing for me is I had no idea how much I needed to see this movie. Like I said, I grew up in white space, or being one of very few Asians around, and not having people to relate to the little things that I know about and the things that happen in my family, these traditions that, and even the power dynamic within an Asian family. Not to have people to relate to that as I was growing up is, you don't even know that you missed that until you are experiencing it. And so for me, I could not wait for this movie to come out. When I first heard about it, I read the books, I read the entire series twice. Again, I said, watched the movie 5 times, and I sit here and I'm trying to grab all sorts of people to come watch it with me, because I'm like, you have to see this movie. And I've read so much about the making of this movie, what they went into trying to be, where they were trying to be intentional, or where they kind of had to kind of keep a few things out because there's a lot that happens in a single book that you can't even put into a 2-hour movie. We've all those who read books and watch movies were always disappointed with the movies. I wasn't disappointed. I was so excited. But the biggest thing for me was just being able to show that you can have Asian people in this type of a movie. You don't typically get to see us play these roles. You don't typically get to watch people just live out this experience that look like us. I mean, there are some people who don't want to say, don't just call it a romantic comedy, but it is, at its surface, just a romantic comedy. And the fact that it was a romantic comedy that looked the way it did and could still be successful, for me, that meant something. I don't know if I've used it in my 5. I'm going to keep it at that because I know we're going to talk more, so I'll let Lex go on.
Jing, I'm an assistant professor in the history department. So I actually have 2 reactions after watching this movie. So the first reaction is, it really strikes me Rachel as an assistant professor at NYU, and she is so happy. And her spring break is so long. I was like, I probably should work for NYU.
She didn't have to check her email.
I mean, I was like at the end of the movie, so I think you should do writing and research at least 30 days. I'm sorry, at least 30 minutes every day, as I do, when you wake up in the morning. So this is my first reaction. So the second reaction is, I do see why it's so, it will hit the right group and have such a strong reaction. Particularly from Asian Americans. So I didn't grow up in the United States. I actually grew up in Shanghai, China. So I only got here 10 years ago. And after I arrived here, I started to learn how to be an Asian American because this is so new to me, and especially being an Asian American man and how people perceive me in the society. And this is a new phenomenon. I never experienced that. So. One thing I learned is there's a profound feminization of Asian men so in this society. So if any of you took Modern East Asia with me or Modern China with me, next semester, you will learn this phenomenon feminizing the group of people who you are not familiar with is a strategy that a lot of emperors was used. The Chinese were using that many years ago. The feminizing, trying to denigrate the people they're not familiar with. For example, the people from Europe, they feminize them. So for example, the people from Eurasia. So they always do that. So it's a strategy. The people want to preserve their power and also to conceal their insecurity. So this is what I learned so far, and I do feel there is, so the movie was trying to give a new definition for Asian American men, for how they should be perceived, what they're supposed to do, especially in this society, in a white space like this. So I think it got very good reaction, a lot of, flash, in the TV, you can see their body was different from people, how they so usually perceived. So this is one thing. So another thing is, I do see the director and also the writer continue to feminize Asian American characters emotionally. So towards the end, I think, what was her name? Astrid. Yes. So Astrid. So she was, criticizing her husband was cheating on her, and also criticizing her for doesn't have the nerve to take reactions, for his life. So I do see there's a continued feminization in terms of the emotionality of Asian American male characters. So this is what I observed. You know, I'm still learning how to be an Asian American in this society. You know, and I'm still learning how people perceive me on a day-to-day basis. You know, after reading my teaching evaluations, you know, oh, this is how people think about me. So this is all new to me, and I think this movie it's a great dosage to tell people, you know, so we shouldn't judge people based on their cover. You know, first of all, and then the second part, there's just so much about a person behind his face, behind his body. There's just so much going on undercurrent. I guess this is what I want to say about this movie. This is what I got. Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name's Amanda Morelli. I'm the administrative coordinator downstairs in the Multicultural First Generation Student Support Office. So I've jotted down a few points that I just wanted to briefly go over. But I'm transracially adopted, if you couldn't tell from my last name, Morelli. I was born in China and I was raised in an Italian-American family. So like Maria, I grew up very much in white space, so this is like awesome to see a movie that has, I mean, more or less take for granted East Asian Americans, and it's important to point out. So for me, that's really important, and I was really excited by that. And like when the movie came on originally, like I thought I was gonna cry. I was like, this is so exciting. Like, is this what it feels like to be white all the time? You know what I mean? Because you know, so I'm just like, wow, cool, privilege that we don't get. But besides that, so a few things I did want to point out also that how much I love the way that Asian men were very much framed within this movie. Just to go off of what Lex said in terms of like the way that men are very much like Asian men are sexualized, non-sexualized, emasculized, and stuff like that. I think it's awesome to show them in a different light because Asian men are beautiful, and like I'm tired of seeing within a lot of mainstream dating culture that like, oh, I don't date Asian men. You know what I mean? So it's important to like deconstruct that and like think of why you have that kind of preference that you have. I also think it's awesome that there is a queer Asian within the movie. Generally, when you think of the LGBTQ community, you think of like a cisgendered white male, you know? So, man, excuse me. So it's awesome to see like queer POC. Sorry, I'm nervous. I hate public speaking. I don't know why I signed up for this. Queer people of color within, you know, the framework. So I think that's great. I also really like the fact that there was a difference between Asian and Asian American, which I think is really important to point out. Not to say that I'm not proud of being Asian and having those roots, but I am Asian American. And I think within the topic of discussion in terms of like racism and just like a lot of racial issues, a lot of times Asian Americans are mixed together in with Asians, but like the experiences we face are completely different, and our opinions that we have are very different. And the first thing that comes to my mind is like in Utah, that white girl that wore the traditional Chinese outfit for prom. You know, New York Times came out with an article being like, oh hey, like I don't know why everyone's complaining because look at all like these Chinese people that like don't see anything wrong with it. And I'm like, yeah, but they're Chinese. They don't understand the racial context within the US. Chinese is different than Chinese American. So I'm really happy that that movie kind of touched upon that a little bit. Let's see, something else. I really like Rachel's character in terms of also showing that she comes from an immigrant family. Generally, she's not of class fluidity. So I think that's kind of a nice dynamic within the Asian minority myth and showing that like all Asians are really rich and that, you know, we're not really people of color and we don't struggle as well. So I like that dynamic. In terms of critiques, you know, within Singaporean society, East Asians are clearly not the only representation. There's a lot of South Asians, a lot more Southeast Asians. Why is everyone in that movie so light-skinned? So it's important to also think about that. I understand within like the main characters, they should be lighter skinned because generally speaking, they're the ones that hold the money and the power. But you know, it's important to look at within the background of it. It's kind of like Friends, like how in the background in New York City, everyone was white, and you're like, you know that's not New York City. So it's kind of like that with Singapore too, and that's important to keep in mind also. Yeah, so that was a critique for that. In terms of, you know, the Asian cast, I also would love to see just in general, even darker skinned East Asians. Like I'm pretty light skinned, but my sister's dark skinned, and I would love to have her look at other Chinese people who are dark skinned on film. People with more mono eyelids, you know, flat noses, round faces. Like we don't need like, you know, only POCs that represent us to be so Eurocentric within their features, you know? So I think that's also something to point out that I would look forward to for a different movie that has a more full Asian cast. But overall, I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to hear all your opinions on it as well.
All right. Hi everyone. I'm Gohar Siddiqui. I teach in visual and performing arts. I teach in the Screen Studies program. So I enjoyed the film, and I had a long conversation with Maria after that. So So I'm going to present the flip side of what she said. I do agree with everything that Maria and Amanda and even Lex you've said in terms of like the positivity of representation of Asian Americans. But I want to talk about the limits of the politics of the film. And I have sort of 4 points, and I'm going to be the boring academic here. I have stuff written down because I forget things. First has to do with a little bit with what Parminder talked about, except that I'm approaching it from a slightly different place. The film sort of shifts the center, right? So we are used to, like, we are no longer seeing the world of like spoiled rich white people in like Gossip Girl, right? Like shows which sort of reproduce the global neo-colonial naturalization of whiteness with white Western lives, their upper class privilege, and their control over global corporations. So the film kind of shifts the center away from there. There are the one centers, and here Singapore becomes the cosmopolitan center. And being American, diasporic Chinese American, but American is seen as less than in some ways, right? And in fact, it is seen as contaminated because it has come in contact with the West. Representation matters, and yet the ways in which global capitalism functions right now, and Sheila Sandoval and Chandra Mohanty have talked about it, is no longer in terms of first and third world, but instead in terms of 1/3 and 2/3 world, where there are these spaces of privilege in so-called third world spaces where people have a ton of money and there are people who are exploited in those spaces. Similarly, there are places in 1/3 worlds where there are really poor people, like poor women of color, there are sweatshops even in the United States, etc. So we have to approach it slightly differently, and if we think about it in that way, then the film isn't really shifting the center in the same way. So I think, I think both things are important. So like, I think interpretation rests in between where these two spaces kind of hit. In addition to what Amanda said, I read this article by this activist, Sangeeta Tanpal, who talked about how the Singaporean state embarked on a form of eugenics in the 1980s, and how, which meant to displace its indigenous population and replace it with settler colonial Chinese people. So it has been really hard for minorities to find jobs, etc. And there is, like, what the film does is in some ways erasure of those very people that the state is doing. So there's something going on there too. And another thing that Maria and I talked about was, there are different Asians represented as this, like, so the film's name is Crazy Rich Asians, but it's, and what I sensed from the film was, I haven't read the books, was that it kind of represents a Chinese identity, Chinese Singaporean identity. But Maria, who has read a lot of stuff, told me that what they did was they found a lot of people, they wanted people who looked Asian, right? But they are not all from China or from Chinese heritage. So there are people from
Thai,
Philippines, Thai, Malay. Nick is British Chinese, British Malaysian, right? So there's all of this mixing, which kind of feeds into this idea of, oh, we cannot tell the difference between who's Chinese, who's Japanese, etc. So I'm thinking of audiences the whole time, because I was watching it and I'm like, no, there are differences here, and the film is sort of, in some ways, erasing them. But at another level, it's the effort that they've made to make sure that there are Asians that are representing Asianness. So again, there's this tension. My third thing, which is again about audiences, I'm a film person, and this is the genre of romantic comedy. And romantic comedy tends to sort of take the point of view of the woman, right? At least narratively takes the point of view of the woman. And in this film, the camera sort of is detached at several places. It's sort of like the scene where they first go to Amma's place, like where the racist, no, not racist, the scary Indian guys who are usually never scary. So the scary Indian guys are there with guns, and these women become very similar to white femininity, the way it gets represented in the United States. But like when they do, the camera kind of detaches, pans up, the music kind of crescendos and shows this lavish space, right? So there's this iconography of visual tourism of Singapore that's happening through money and also through some visual markers. Similarly, like when the flower sort of blooms, the people are talking, the camera is with them, and then all of a sudden it ignores them and goes like right, almost like getting too close to the flowers. And I'm wondering what kind of a gaze is this, right? Because sometimes what we are seeing is like this envy almost. Other times, like the ways in which fun is being made, which might have been an attempt to show this sarcastic sort of approach to this world that is being viewed, but we don't get that sarcasm. What we get is this distance, which we are supposed to fill with interpretation. So then it is the audience's job, and then it depends on where the audience is located and what knowledges they're bringing to this film. So that's what I'm thinking, because I think the camera's gaze is a very Hollywood gaze. So what does the Hollywoodization of this film do, and what kind of ideological work does that gap invite? And finally, it's a film, I think, it's a film about women. Like the thing that I find really important about this, it's between Eleanor and Rachel. Men are, I'm glad they are there. I'm glad that they are represented like as beautiful male bodies who are objectified as opposed to women who are objectified usually. I have a little bit of a problem with the gay male character because he's this importation of the Hollywood stereotype of gayness somewhere, and that's the only person. On the other hand, the cousin, who is always like firing with these phallic objects, is also like this. There's this campy detachment, but there's also certain, I think there's coding that's happening there too. But the film, I think, is the power of the film comes from the fact that it is about women, and we have seen film about Asian men. There's Harold and Kumar. There's the one with Jon M that just came out. Searching, and it's a good, right? So there's something about women, and it's about the two women. It's about their power. Like it doesn't matter what Nick thinks, what choice he has. In some ways, I think there's like this Bollywood film, DDLJ, Dulale Dulaniya Le Jayenge. It's a similar dynamic where the diasporic guy hero will not take the girl until her father approves. So it's patriarchy being kind of happening through the two men, and here patriarchy happening through the two women, but it's still women. Like men are, like older men, fathers are absent, and younger men, like they're eye candy, I think, or humble. But given all of that, representation matters, representation matters. So I am extremely conflicted about the film. Those are my viewpoints, and I would love to know what you have to say about that.
My name is Jing. I am a former Clarkie. Well, I guess once a Clarkie, always a Clarkie. Class of 2012, bachelor's degree. 13 with my master's degree in teaching. I currently work at Harvard doing work with the public schools in Cambridge, Alston, and Brighton, which are neighborhoods in Boston. Could talk ad nauseum about the work I do, but I grew up in a very white space as well, in Arlington, Massachusetts, about an hour east of here. And grew up in a very Irish Catholic town. All my friends growing up were white. I would look in the mirror every morning and be like, can I make my nose like a little pointier, and I'm gonna hold my eyes open a little bit wider, like for a long time. And then in high school kind of became awakened to the idea of my identity as an Asian American, and kind of realizing like, wait a second, not all my friends eat with chopsticks when they go home. And they love to come over because I always have rice, but I hate rice because I eat it all the time. So kind of slowly coming into myself as an Asian American, and noticing when I was in college that there are very few people like me represented, not just in movies, but in the books I'm reading. All of the literature I read in high school was just, by and large, written by old, dead, white guys, which is great. There's a lot of merit in those novels and those texts, but coming to college and taking classes with professors like Betsy and like Esther Jones with Parminder really opened my eyes to the fact that there's a whole world outside of my existence and our existence on campus here, but also kind of broader than that. So when this movie came out, it was actually my boyfriend who pointed me out to the trailer first. Broke out, flipped out, so excited. And kind of like Maria, this was, like seeing this movie was the highlight of my year, and I saw it again and again. Have me beat, I've only seen it 3 times. But
Let's go watch that backwards.
Yeah, let's chat. But so this idea that representation is so important, kind of supersedes almost all else. but the fact that I love this movie so much means that I have to take a critical eye to it in terms of, you love the things that you love, and then you hold them accountable for being better. So building off points about masculinity, yes, like Nick and Colin are so smoking hot. Sorry, Peter. My boyfriend is here. But these representations of men are great as eye candy. We're reversing this role. But also, what about these representations of Oliver and of Picklin's father and of PT? Like, why, first of all, is he so creepy? Is this, we laugh about it, but why are we laughing? Are we laughing because we're uncomfortable? And as women, we're familiar with what it feels like to, be in this place of like, I don't want this gaze on me, but he's sitting across the table slurping noodles, so what am I supposed to do? And then Ken Jeong's character as kind of this idea that, men in this movie are not very present. So why are 3 out of the 5 primary male characters this kind of standard Hollywood representation of maleness and Asian maleness? So kind of something to percolate on. I am really excited to talk about food. I'm kind of shocked that nobody's talked about food yet. But just the depictions of food in this movie kind of being the one thing that unifies Eastern Asians and Western Asians, because who doesn't love food? And so just really enjoying the depictions of food, kind of seeing, oh, I ate that as a kid, I ate that as a kid, that we only ate at fine banquets, and kind of just noticing even at that market scene in the night market, Nick is speaking multiple languages. He's speaking Mandarin, he's speaking Malay, I believe. It's just multiple languages, and I think the representation therein of different types of East Asian and Asian languages being spoken is important. And I think it's also pointed that they didn't closed caption everything that was said. So that when I left the movie, I was able to parse out which languages were being spoken when. But when I went to see the movie with a lot of friends who didn't speak Asian languages, they were like, well, where are the subtitles? I didn't understand it. And I had to take a moment to point out to them, well, that's not for you. This movie, you're welcome to come see it. We're happy to have you. But this movie, like all of the movies that are made for you, this is for me and for people who look like me. So food is great, love it. And then also the music that was used in the movie, love that it was all Asian language music, which is really, really cool. We took my parents to see it, and my mom knew every single song except for Yellow. So that was really fun. And it just kind of, as a film, as an experience, seeing it was very unifying and very uplifting for someone who grew up as a millennial in Asian America, kind of having this representation of people who are going to look like me, my age, working universities, liking the same things that I like, was very, very important. And I'm very hopeful that, unlike the Joy Luck Club 25 years ago, that this is kind of the genesis for actual representation and further representation and more accurate kind of global representation of Asians, and not just kind of like, well, everyone's really excited about this one movie that satisfies Asian America for like another 25 years. But I think that this generation of young folks, millennials and below, kind of with our access to technology, I don't think we're gonna let that fly. So I'm really excited about this movie, and I can't wait for the sequel. I'm so excited. That's it.
So, hi, I'm Nadine. I'm Associate Professor of English and Director of Africana Studies at Holy Cross. I'm once again crashing at Clark event. Thank you for allowing me into your space. I always like to come over here. It's really hard to go after lots of amazing points have already been said and not feel like you're just agreeing with everybody, but I largely am, and to reiterate. So I guess I'm going to just try and touch on or reinforce a few things that have already been said and add a couple of observations, a couple of defenses of scenes from the film, and a couple of critiques, I think. I was talking about this with Maria earlier, that I think it's really interesting that there are a lot of similarities, I think, between this and Black Panther in terms of the
the huge anticipation and the anxieties around it, and the anxieties about how it would be received. And so, you know, Black Panther had concerns about the accent and things like that, so thinking about the languages. And so I was saying that, you know, this is part of a trilogy. I also read the books this summer because everybody was so excited. I was like, I should read these novels and figure out what's going on. So thinking about some of the changes that they had to make, and of course you always have to edit down from a book, but I felt like they played it very safe. Like it seemed to me very clear, like they weren't entirely sure this was going to get greenlit for a trilogy. So they wanted to be very clear they could make a standalone movie. And so I think that's part of it. And then I also had read, and I'm sure Maria has stalked this online extensively, that Jon M, the director, had to like beg to get the rights to the Coldplay song, and Coldplay was concerned about releasing it because the title is Yellow, and they were like, are we going to seem racist if we allow our song to be in a movie about Asian people? And he had to write a whole letter being like, I know people think, you know, and so again, I think that sort of anxiety about like how is this going to be seen, you know, certainly to a sort of to the American audience. Similarly, in terms of the kind of response Black Panther had, where it, I think, cast a lot of light on long simmering tensions between African and African American communities. And absolutely here you see some of the tensions between Asian and Asian American communities. And certainly I've been getting an earful from a friend of mine who is Singaporean of Malaysian descent who despises like everything about this movie, in stark contrast to most of my Asian American friends who are, you know, have seen it multiple times and have been so excited. I am not Asian, although my campus twin is, so I feel a little bit of, you know, borrowed glory through that. But so speaking slightly as an outsider and someone who is sort of woefully underinformed, particularly about the sort of history and nuances of Singapore, and couldn't, you know, identify the changes in languages, say. So I was one of those outside viewers. But I also thought in the character of Rachel, there was a lot that also spoke to anyone who's, say, bicultural or biracial, and particularly the subversion of our expectations that, like, of course I will fit in there because, you know, I look Chinese, and so to me the really telling exchange is when, you know, it's being like, your face is Chinese, but, you know, your heart is American, and so that sort of rejection of the assumption that, of course, she would fit in, she has this heritage. And so I think that, again, is a sort of much more common experience with sort of partial rejections or realizing the sort of, the ways that your sort of cultural upbringing doesn't match the broader cultural upbringing. I want to push back a little bit to how Parminder had framed things, when she was like, I don't think this movie was fluff, you know, it was dynamic and important, and I don't actually think that like fluff and important are mutually exclusive. And so some of this is a little bit of a defense of the rom-com as a genre, which, as Gohar was saying, is often dismissed because it caters to women. So I too, you know, not to sound like I'm in favor of objectification, but like I too enjoyed the pandering to the female gaze that went on in this. And the two scenes that I think were not supposed to be funny that made me laugh out loud were the like super gratuitous, like, why do we see Michael getting out of the shower, you know, like, because he's ripped, you know, like, or the scene that is not in the novel, right? Yeah, the scene that's not in the novel when Nick is changing his shirt and like comes towards the screen and he's like unbuttoning his shirt. I was like, thank you, Candy.
It's perfect lighting.
Like,
What are you talking about?
Right? Like I was like, this is worth my $12.75, you know. And beyond that, like especially the last 2 years, I feel like have been, you know, very hard, right? They've just sort of been constantly upsetting and tiring, and I really enjoy sitting for 2 hours and watching like very pretty people in sort of, you know, wealth porn, sort of very pretty places and experiences, and knowing that it's going to have a very pretty conclusion. And I do think there's actually a lot that is sort of very important and restorative in that, and they're saying that sort of the rom-com had kind of died out as a genre a little bit and is now sort of making this resurgence between this and also with interesting questions of Asian representation on Netflix. The YA, yes, thank you. That YA novel. So that scene is like, signaling a new turn and a new movement for the rom-com and a more diverse rom-com, right? Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no reason that Chris Pang should not join the sort of pantheon of like hot Hollywood Chris's, right?
Yes.
Like, and I think that again, it's really important for that. And to work against the long-standing sort of Hollywood resistance to see Asian men as, you know, potential sort of leading, you know, sort of romantic figures. So I think the film is really important for that. So again, I cannot speak, or I sort of am aware of, but can't speak very, very intelligently about the more nuanced difficulties about kind of ethnic representation in the film. So the two things that I kind of want to defend about the film, I think, and a little bit about the books. And if you're into the food, the books are like way more about the food.
Yeah.
The books are just like a food journal and fashion.
All the footnotes.
Yeah, a lot of footnotes helpfully explaining about food. And so this is going to sound a bit like I'm kind of equivocating, and maybe I am, and you can push back on this in the comments. But I think that if the film and the books themselves don't offer a very, say, robust critique of this kind of wealth, I do think at least that they're sort of honest in leaving the sort of films that look together, that they leave themselves open to that critique about the wealth. Like, there's a lot more in the books, I would say, especially about how this wealth is sort of accumulated and displayed, and in particular the sort of like imperialist and colonialist kind of traditions. And so this is one of the things that I'm actually going to critique that I really was disturbed by in the film. So in the novels, there's a lot about these Indian guards, but they're not played for that kind of like gross kind of like, oh, they're dark and scary popping out of the woods. Instead, it's much more of a sustained commentary of like, just like the British would have loved to sort of, keep parading around people in traditional, uniform for 100 years past its date, so too does the grandmother, in the way that it's seen as a sort of very British aspiration to have these markers of wealth. I will say the film, I think the closest it comes to offering the critique is that I think you were invited as an audience to absolutely see like Colin's bachelor party as very, sort of disgusting and materialistic, which it is. And then slightly more subtly, I think in the scene where Rachel is running away from in the wedding reception, and I think this was actually some of John Chu's like better and more subtle filmmaking, I feel like the turn the wedding reception makes to the grotesque. Like she's sort of, the way that the camera is working, the camera's gaze is working, and her kind of responses is as if she's seeing it with new eyes and realizing like this sort of level of materialism is disgusting. Most of these people are disgusting. And I think that is one of the few times when the movie actually sort of pauses and acknowledges that like there is something not okay with this sort of vast accumulation of wealth operating like this. So those are two things I thought were sort of slightly more subtle and good. And certainly the sort of racism of the way this wealth is. So in the novels, there's a lot about the women talking about how they want like Filipina maids, for whatever reason. And so that is a little bit more kind of transparent in the books and was lost a little bit in the film, I think. In terms of critique, I would agree with what's already been offered. As I said, the scene with the guard was one of the ones that disappointed me the most. It just felt like very sort of lazy writing and kind of pandering to an American audience. And similarly, I also was disappointed in the character of Oliver that I felt like was really just sort of a camp stereotype. Particularly, again, it seemed a little bit lazy in the way that it seemed very careless about sort of thinking about like, well, what does homosexuality mean in Singapore? Which I'm assuming might mean something very different than, say, like New York or LA in terms of how it works. And he just was sort of like the gay best friend fashion guru. And we didn't see, and again, he gets a lot more depth in the novels, which I know you can't really do in the movies, but I thought it leaned a little bit too much on kind of established expectations. So those were my critiques. Now we'll wrap it up there, I think.
Again, my name is Betsy Huang. I am a faculty member in the English department and also, again, the director of the Center for Gender-Race and Studies. And these are really, really hard acts to follow, but I also feel very happy that I could sort of rest my case right now and everything, and there's just so many things, smart things that have already been said that we have plenty of material to work with. But since I'm a long-winded academic myself, I probably want to say something anyway. First, it's always interesting because I was just teaching my course this morning, which is a course called Ethnic America, Literature, Politics, and Theory, and some of my students are here. And we talked at length about the ethics of representation and the aesthetics of representation. And if we're thinking about the ethics of representation and also the aesthetic devices that people use, right, in the interest of representation, so much of what has already been shared really gets at the kinds of choices that are made, of course, first of all, by the film producers and makers, by the writer of the novels that precipitated the sort of visual delivery of the narrative, and then furthermore, the kinds of ethics of reading and interpreting and consuming, the ethics of consuming these types of products, right? What do we do with the narratives and and the visual vocabularies that have been laid before us. You know, all of these things are at play, right? So it's actually really fabulous to just get so many different angles immediately put on the table for us to consider. Among so many of the things that have been shared, let me just sort of recap, because that's also what I like to do in class. We started out with Parminder's comments, which of course had a lot to do with the flow of capital and how this is a particular kind of product, right, in a kind of globalizing society where the modes of production and the modes of consumption are sort of distributed widely across the globe. And then it's tied to this notion of diaspora representation in the sense that, as someone has said, does this film in some ways erase the granular distinctions among various Asian groups by lumping them all together, or does it actually accommodate the range of the Asian diaspora? It's, you know, we don't know which it does, right? Does it erase the differences, or does it accommodate a range of differences? You could see it either way, and of course, that depends, as some have already shared, depends on the way that you consume and interpret this film, right, as a member of the audience. There's also, of course, the politics of representation, or representational politics, which, of course, in what watching, we're all very, very keen to, and very sort of acutely aware of the stakes, right? So, and I think that it's already been sort of very well said about how important this film is, really for the representational sort of stakes in politics in Hollywood in particular, right? In other markets and in other cinematic histories, the representational politics as it matters here may be very different. So there is, as Lex pointed out, this sort of history of feminization and emasculation of particularly Asian men in the Hollywood and Western sort of filmmaking history, right? So the idea that we now, again, as everyone has shared, you know, this sort of a turn or a flip of this gaze, right, to accommodate the gaze that is not driven by a male gaze in film is really, really important. But we can think about whether or not simply flipping the script or flipping the gaze, what that ultimately does. Because flipping does not necessarily mean challenging the very structure that preserves the power of the gaze, right? So you flip it, but you're still preserving the power of whoever happens to hold the gaze. So you're not necessarily challenging or transforming the structure of power at all, right? You're just changing up who is actually inhabiting the perspective of the gaze. So let's see. There's also mentioning, I think Amanda had said, about the idea of watching this film as an Asian American or a self-identifying Asian American, feeling that sense of white privilege, right? Being a member of the norm, or, you know, the dominant sort of cultural group represented, you know, on screen. And here, let me interject with a bit of my anecdote. So when I first stepped into the theater, and I have to admit, I watched this film for the very first time last Friday. So I'm late to the game. And furthermore, I watched it myself because I just kind of need that space where I don't really want a lot of chatter around me to immediately kind of influence the way I think about this film. I just like some private time between me and this thing, right? So it was interesting because I was in a theater of, let's see, me and maybe only about 10 other people because it was a matinee. And I have to say that I'm an immigrant. My family moved to this country in the mid-70s, right? And I was 10 years old at the time. And 42 years in this country, this is, interestingly, one of the very few times, if not the very first time, when at the end of the film, I felt the presence, palpably, of everybody else in the theater, all of whom were white, I was the single Asian person in that theater. And I felt that I was a member of the cultural insider and that they were outsiders. And that I was not as concerned as I always am whenever there are Asians on screen in the United States about how Asians are perceived by the white audience. I was not really concerned with that this time around. And I knew that there a flip has actually occurred also. So that was edifying, gratifying, right? But then at the same time, anytime we flip, we want to think about whether or not merely flipping actually changes anything or challenges anything. Okay. So, I loved what everyone shared about what we do with Rachel Chu as an academic, several of us here are professors. And it's so interesting because, you know, when you enter into the film, certainly as someone who self-identifies as Asian American and Chinese American, and someone who, for whom the character Rachel likely would be the point of identification for me, right? I am a cisgendered Chinese American woman. I'm an immigrant. I'm a professor. And furthermore, Constance Wu plays another Huang on television, right? And one of the things that has always sort of continued to kind of blow my mind is with the sitcom Fresh Off the Boat, going into what, the third season or fourth season now on television? Fourth? Yeah. I mean, quite honestly, in all my years here in the United States, I never thought that I would see my family name as the name of a family featured in an American sitcom. And that has happened, right? And Constance Wu plays a Huang. So I'm thinking, okay, there are so many ways in which I immediately identify with Constance Wu's character. So there are that expected point of interpolation or identification. There are other moments of familiarity, such as some of the facial expressions of many of the maternal figures in the film are very familiar to me. I see my mother, my grandmother, my aunties, you know, making those kinds of faces of disapproval. I just know them so thoroughly. I've been through, you know, Mahjong boot camp with a lot of them, and it's like, God forbid, if you take 1 extra second to flip a tile, it's like, speed it up, you know, no time for fooling around when you play Mahjong. But the points of familiarity end there. What happens after that are really moment after moment of feeling kind of alienated from it. The displays of wealth, right? The kind of world that is portrayed in Singapore. The lifting of the Rachel character from a familiar American academic, higher educational context, you know, the lecture hall, into a world where it's very science fiction-y. And, you know, there have been some pretty smart pieces written about, you know, again, the idea of imagining an alternative kind of fantasy space as it was done in Black Panther through Wakanda. And now here, through other kinds of devices, a kind of fantasy space that is not at all corresponding to any sense of reality that I have, right? Which is this sort of, you know, how did you call it? Wealth porn, right? Of Singapore. So, let's see. Other kinds of things that were important, of course, is the distinctions between Asian and Asian American, which, you know, for all of the 14 years that I've spent here at Clark University, I every year had to make that distinction to all kinds of folks, you know, from faculty colleagues to students to just everybody who went out into space, right? So just having that distinction made in the film is important, certainly to me, but whether or not that distinction matters or is registered as significant by the end of the film, I'm curious about, right? Singaporean colorism is so important, right? I mean, because if we're not talking about the articulations of racial thinking and racism as we understand it here in the United States context, and we can think about colorism as it plays out in the Singaporean context, right? And how, again, once again, it corresponds to caste and wealth. And then finally, again, I think that Gohar had mentioned, shifting the center, right? Shifting the sort of gaze and the attention from the center. This is the one structure of Jon Chu's filmmaking that I actually really appreciated also, which is several of us have already mentioned what to do about the genre of rom-com, and also modes, what we would call modes. And by mode, I mean it's slightly different from genre. And by mode, I mean satire versus romance, right? Now, to what extent, if the novels were written as satirical examinations of this type of wealth, right, in Singapore, does that satire still register as such, as biting critique, when in fact the reproductions of aspiration and desire in the film, right, are so powerful that ultimately at the very end, do you still walk away feeling as though if there are happy resolutions at the end, if that resolution is somehow achieved only by way of accessing and being included in that space of wealth? Is there a way to imagine a happy resolution that does not, right, that does not tap or access that wealth? It is not really imagined. And then let me just, if you permit me, just a couple of scenes that I actually really appreciated that I think the smart viewer will pick up. In terms of the feeling of white privilege, well, there is a very smart way that Jon Chu shows that white privilege has been sort of handed over to Asians. Okay? And it begins at the very beginning of the film, when, and these are very familiar tropes to those of us who study the structures of the visual vocabulary of caste and class in film. Right? You recall Eleanor in the hotel, who has just bought the entire place, right? But think of the Lord, right? The white, sort of British, old money, coming down the elevator, stepping out of the elevator, and it's great because it symbolizes the idea of, in some ways, the kind of descent of the old sort of British colonial power, and handing that privilege and power to Asians, writ large, but really the wealthy Chinese, right? And incidentally, Singapore demographics show that Chinese obviously are the ethnic Han-Chinese are the dominant ethnic or racial group in Singapore, about 74%, right? And then 13% are Malay, and then let's see. And then there's like what remains is caste is the other, right? So there is that sort of symbolic handing over of white privilege and power, and also colonial power from white to Asian. Right? And then another scene that makes use of this verticality, right? That signals the movement among sort of class fluidity and such is the staircase scene. Those of you who are familiar with Downton Abbey and Edith Wharton and Henry James and all this stuff know that there are prodigious uses of staircases, right, to signal class standing, right? So you recall that Rachel walks up to the landing, and then she goes right, and she goes left, and she doesn't know where she's going, clearly signaling the fact that she does not know where to go as she ascends, or tries to ascend, or tries to inhabit this space. Right, that is very carefully structured according to your class standing. And then, of course, Eleanor comes up, right, and they have a talk, right, and then Eleanor very, very visibly and threateningly pushes, right, Rachel down one step off the landing, right? So if you unpack that scene, you understand that it is Eleanor saying that you cannot ascend. You must go back, to where you came from, as it were. And then picking up on the whole game theory business, well, that verticality is at the very end, replaced by the horizontality of the mahjong table, right? Where there, as some of you have pointed out, the game is played on Rachel's terms. And there, the mahjong table is meant to signify more sort of horizontal gameplay as opposed to a vertical gameplay, right? That emphasizes class and height and things like that. So that's my little sort of structuralist breakdown. But beyond that, I think I'm way over my 5 minutes, so the worst offender of them all. So I want to say thank you to all of our panelists for collectively unpacking. And a round of applause for everybody. So let's see. Why don't we open up to anyone here who would like to share some thoughts? And it could be from any angle at all. You can share, again, what your reactions were when you first saw it, before you saw it, after you saw it, and anything else that has been thrown out that you'd like to pick up. Okay, so I'm going to just set up a queue, okay? So let's see, you first, followed by you, and then you back there.
So I grew up in Singapore for like 3 years. I was there before moving to California, Palo Alto, California, to be exact, where John is from. So like I've witnessed the dynamics behind the Singaporean scenes and the standard educated Rachel Chu, what type of person she is. But the question that I wanted to ask all you guys is the film is it better for the film to be realistic, or is it better for the film to be politically correct?
Sorry, finish, sorry.
Because I can tell you the truth. The film is pretty realistic, capturing Singaporean culture, the rich money culture, the rich Chinese billionaire culture, and Rachel Chu being from where she grew up near where I grew up, so I see a lot of characters around my area that are pretty much a Rachel Chu. And I'm just wondering, what matters the most? The film is realistic, or is it politically correct? Because there's some scenes in the film that can be considered pretty racist, how all the guards, or the people opening the door, they were all Indian. Servers, they were all Southeast Asian, darker skin than Chinese people. While it's in Singapore, that's actually kind of the case. But is that something that belongs on Hollywood screens or not?
That question from you.
What's that?
I should be asking that question from you. Okay.
Well, I was going to say, because that's something that has come up with, at least in a lot of the conversations I've had, actually even with a lot of members of the panels. Like I said, I've read the book several times, the series several times, and from what I've heard, Kevin Kwan says, this is what I know, this is the Singapore I know. So for me, with that piece of information, to him, this is the realistic Singapore. So when I hear that, it would have been nice if we saw more of this, or if we got more of this, part of me goes, it would be, but that's not the book he wrote, and that's not what the movie was based on. And so for me, I think having read the books and having read a lot of those articles where they kind of explain that, I kind of defend the movie a lot to folks that do. But I understand the critiques, because we are at a point where we want to show things the way we'd like to see it, or have better representation, but at the same time, I was taking that movie for what it was based off of the book and that experience that the author was trying to portray.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, just sort of unpack your question a little bit. If by politically correct, you or we mean that it should, that Singapore, as it is, in terms of the choices that Jon Chu has made about, how to help the audience visualize it, right? Should it stay close to what Kevin Kwan has envisioned it to be? Or should it be more inclusive of all of these other populations that inhabit the space of Singapore, right? I think that we can sort of ask the question maybe a little bit differently. That is, and it's a good question, it's an important question, because I think it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds. But maybe a different way into it is, yes, there is Kevin Kwan's Singapore. That's a reality, but that is a reality, not the entire reality of Singapore. And one always wonders when, let's say, for example, if you make visible the service staff, right? And you make visible the labor that supports or undergirds all of this display of wealth and capital. If you make those those layers visible, then what do you do with them? And this is where the ethics of the viewer come in. Once the flip side of this display of wealth is made visible, what do you do with it? Do you also acknowledge their reality, right? And then you don't need to do it in the space of the film, but certainly it'll encourage us to think about how Singapore and how all of this wealth form looks like from their perspective, right? And then maybe someone will make a film about that. So the idea is to make them visible. So, and then there's, art is always risky, right? You can invisibilize something in order to completely shut down any, any opportunity to even.
Sorry, that's an extra one.
Great thing. Shut down, or preempt, any attention, right, to these layers. Or you can make them visible and take that risk and see what people do with it.
There's a difference between representation and attitude towards it. So there is the world that is being represented, and then there's the attitude towards the people who are being represented. And those are two different things. And what I gather, I read 10 pages of the book. I got them last week. I said I need to read them. But there is more detail in the books about the lives of these people. The attitude is slightly more different than the film does. And the film, in adapting it, is an interpretation of the book. So there has been specific choices made in order to sort of condense the story. I understand it's like a whole novel, we're doing that, but those choices are ideological, and those choices are what is resulting in this problem.
And from a historical perspective, the director has a very difficult job to deal with this convergence of two types of colonialism. You have the colonialism from the West, and you have earlier colonialism, the early time of colonialism, which made by the Chinese, the Southeast Asia convergence, to sweep through this whole region. There are a lot of Chinese immigrants living there. So there are two types of colonialism, converge in Singapore. And you have the Indian guards, who was part of the colonial legacy. In Shanghai, there are a lot of Indian guards lived before 1949, so it was part of history. So I think he wants to respect the authenticity, of that part. So that's why he showed it on screen.
And I think for us, in terms of just pointing out that, the main cast is light-skinned, it's very Chinese-based for the most part. I think that's more just a reality check for us in terms of our privilege. So when we say that this movie is important within Asian American history, we're talking a very specific Asian American group. You know what I mean? Because the way that I'm celebrating this movie, I hardly doubt my Indian or Nepali friends are celebrating this movie, or even my Southeast Asian friends are celebrating it. So I just think it's important, when I point out the kind of racial tensions and issues within the movie, it's also just a checkpoint for myself to be you're very privileged in a lot of ways to receive this kind of attention in ways that darker skinned Asians have yet to get. So that's also just something else.
Yes.
So I'm Edward Whaley. I'm assistant professor of economics and law. So the first thing that I was going to say was my reaction to some of the scenes in the movie. When I was watching the movie, there was one scene where the guy was getting out of the shower, and my first reaction was like, that's extra. While they're trying to show us. But then I was like, okay, you guys touched upon it. Yeah, Asian men are viewed as being feminine, even in African societies. They don't have male characteristics, supposedly. So when I saw that scene, I was like, okay, is that an attempt to, to tell us that Asian men are actually handsome? I mean, they are handsome. They have good bodies. So I think they were like making an attempt to actually let us know that they're just as masculine as anybody, any other race. So that was my reaction. Now the question that I have is in terms of the profession that Rachel had. Well, I'm happy she's an academic and specifically an econ professor, so I'm biased here. But I was just wondering, sure, they're trying to show some level of success, but what if she was a blue-collar worker? Or what if she was, I don't know, a financial analyst? What is your interpretation of her profession in the Asian culture? Does it really matter that she's a professor? Like, does that also show some type of status, social status? Would it have mattered if she was a social worker?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think professor is really carefully calibrated as something that has social cachet, but no expectation of any economic success, right? So that's part of it. It's like, how could you be sort of respectable? What for? It's like, oh, a professor. I also think it's interesting that in the book, Nick is also a professor, which they dropped to the film to help with the endless spring break, perhaps. But I think also because there's a way in which perhaps seeing that is not sexy, maybe for him, or like not, like I think I don't know why, like it's unclear what he does, and then you're like, why is she like not asking what her boyfriend does with his time? So this is a question I ran through the movie. But I think in terms of professor, I think again it has a certain kind of class marker, but not the sort of wealth to go with it that makes it very convenient for Rachel's trajectory.
I think it was just because in Asian culture, just at least I know growing up, it really means something if you're intelligent and you're smart.
Yeah.
Like you need to be smart. So yeah, she may not be making a lot of money, but she's a professor. She's really smart, and that was said a couple times, different times during the movie. So yeah, that it puts her up there. It's okay for her to be that at least.
I think that it also adds to Rachel's role in the film as a foil to all of the wealth and power that Asians have, where she, is the daughter of a single parent home. Her mother taught herself English. She didn't go to college. She became a real estate agent. So in Rachel becoming a professor, kind of tells the story of, it's the trajectory that a lot of Asian Americans experience. And maybe that's me kind of reading personally into that. My parents also came from nothing and built a life here and taught themselves English and built a life so that their children would never want for anything. So kind of that trajectory of, she came from nothing and built herself into a professor. Not a doctor or a lawyer, but still a professor. So
That's a doctorate. She's a doctor.
or like a medical.
Yeah.
Different stereotype.
I think it also speaks to a Chinese tradition and Chinese history. Wealth and education are always connected. Through so in pre-modern China, there's a system called civil service examination system. So the wealthy people always invest in their offspring's education, so that they will have the knowledge to reproduce and to reinforce their power in the society. So I think, as Nana said, it's carefully calibrated. It also speaks to the tradition of female education. So women are not allowed to study in school in pre-modern China, but she was well versed. She was highly educated. It tells she has opportunity to join this wealthy family. Otherwise, I don't think she will have any opportunity to be casted in this film. So.
Yeah, so your point is well taken, because the doctorate degree is a form of capital.
Mm-hmm.
Not the same type of capital of the money, right? Or the old.
It's human capital.
What's that?
Human capital.
Right, exactly. Or it signifies differently, but at the same time, it's still capital. Now, if she were, as you say, a blue-collar worker in the United States context, right? she wouldn't have nearly enough capital to be even considered, right? So, I mean, that, these are the kind of, sort of more visibilized flip side, right? So that, yeah. Okay, and, yes.
So thanks to Alice for the brilliant comments. I'm a PhD candidate from the geography department, and my problem with the film begins with the stratification, yet highly problematic title of the film, that is crazy rich Asians. My question is, who gets represented in the film? And of course, it's not the majority of the Asians, and it's not even the majority of Chinese. It would make more sense and more accurate for the film Crazy Rich Singaporeans. Then, what is Singapore? Singapore represents the people the most colonized population without language, culture, institution, and so forth. The Crazy Rich Asians have the privilege to represent and express themselves in the mainstream film, not because of their Asianness, but because of their richness, despite all the cultural symbolism such as and mahjong. And by the way, I looked at mahjong not very well because I'm from southern part of China, the service qualifying me as Chinese. So then the question becomes, can the subalterns, if a film script directed and casted by Asians only reinforces the stereotypes the West has imposed on Asians? If the film addressed the problem with, like Abby mentioned by Professor of easy representation, and rather than critical reflections on real difficult problems, then what are we celebrating? Are we celebrating another post-colonial project that is consciously, unconsciously, or subconsciously accomplished by Asian also?
I missed part of the question.
Yeah, I too. It was hard for me to hear.
Yeah.
Can anyone offer a gist of it? I think that,
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the question is what are we celebrating, considering a lot of the things we've been critical of, the fact that it's not truly representative of the entire Asian diaspora. It's really more not the question. I think you also put the question of, are we celebrating the Asianness or the richness? Basically, what are we so happy about with this movie? When there are definitely some things to be questioning.
And she also pointed out that there's it's Singaporean Chinese. It's not Chinese, and China's a huge country. So how can you possibly, emulate all of that within one movie? So she wanted to also differentiate the two.
And are we going to give a voice to the subaltern group? Is that what we're talking about? People
Right.
working a lower level?
And if we want to read some kind of progressive or radical message in this film, we definitely are unable to do that, because if we're invoking the subaltern here, and the subaltern, of course, is a population that is not even aware of itself as a class, because it is, it's basically like the untouchables. It's, you're so below the layer of social visibility and political empowerment, right? So if we're invoking the subaltern here, who is actually the subaltern? I mean, Asian Americans don't get to claim subaltern status, right, in our consumption of this film, right? But so who is it, right? Once again, it's a question of who is, in some ways, this display of wealth, right, and the good feelings that it supposedly delivers at the very end is then done at the expense of it. But is that an adequate or representation or misrepresentation? Okay, so two people, let's see. You first and then followed by you.
So, Professor Bhachu kind of talked about it right at the beginning, and then Professor Siddiqui kind of touched on it, but I think that it's important to talk about this idea of like a transnational in this film, and also like, I've never been to Singapore, but I'm not so sure, besides the scenic shots of different kind of skyscrapers, what was so uniquely Singaporean about this film. Like, to me, a lot of this film could have been set in Macau or in Hong Kong Beijing, or maybe even in Vancouver or in Palo Alto. And I think just like that transnational quality is also reflected, I was thinking about the beginning when Nick Young is talking to, I'm sorry for but you know, in the very beginning when they're in the bar and the text message kind of goes around the world instantly, and kind of this transnational world that he's living in. And you know, there's no part to go outside of the international borders, and they're on the huge cargo ship. So I was just wondering, is there something about the physical space that is uniquely Asian, or is it the characters themselves that kind of are bringing that quality of
I think this kind of came up in our discussion the other night, because I think you mentioned this could have taken place in a lot of different places. And part of me was thinking, because the huge thing about this movie was that it's the first Hollywood-backed film with an all-Asian cast in 25 years. And part of me is thinking that was kind of the point of a lot of how this came out, was thumbing their nose at how Hollywood has looked at Asian movies and Asian characters and Asian casts. It was a huge thing that Jon Chu went to see when they were casting this. Was he has Thai actors, Filipino actors, Malay actors, and he was intentionally trying to say, well, at least I'm going to assume this, I'm sorry, I don't know Jon Chu personally, but you know, you've always heard the excuse when they've whitewashed movies, especially with Asian characters, is that they can't find enough Asian actors. Well, you got an entire movie who played an entirely wide variety of some stereotypes and character types. You can't say that anymore. Don't use that as an excuse. The fact that it could have taken place anywhere means that, because a lot of times you see Asian scenes, it's usually third world country scenes when you're looking at an Asian country. So I think there was kind of an intentional way of displaying that, yeah, we can put on a big Hollywood budget movie like this. That's how I saw this.
And I think maybe in the list of alternative locations, I think the sort of alternative Asian locations are maybe a bit more valid. Like, I think one of the things that it does do that I certainly found pleasurable to sort of read and to view is exactly this sort of decentering of the United States, and I would say with that, you know, Vancouver. As you know, it's like, so like, especially the novels are incredibly globetrotting. Like, they're all, you know, they're constantly flying their own, you know, like jumbo jets everywhere to go shopping for the weekend, but they never go anywhere in North America because it's so passe, right? And I found that very refreshing. And so, and I think even for, you know, they sort of go to Paris, but they make it very clear they don't want to stay in Paris. And they go to London, but they don't want to stay in London. And I think, again, that sort of recentering of where you feel at home and where you feel sort of powerful, and where you find pleasure. So to sort of, I think it probably could be sort of like Hong Kong or Macau, but I think it would not be, and it would not be the same movie if it were Vancouver.
I think I come back to the scene where Pigman is in her closet with Rachel, right? She pulls this really mega expensive bag down and gives Rachel a very quick rundown of, look, his family's not just rich, he's crazy rich. His family left China a long time ago and went to Singapore. That's how old their money is, versus anywhere else in China where the money is a little bit newer. And you can see that the way her family flouts their money is very, very unlike the way that Nick's family kind of presents themselves as kind of the very higher echelon. So I think
their display is considered vulgar by
that's what it is.
I'm sorry to jump in and interrupt. And I think also the scarcity of space in Singapore is really important, because real estate, right, is the immediate signifier of your sort of wealth, you know, hierarchy in a way that it can't be in sort of more expensive cities. Adds more kind of pressure onto the displays.
Sure. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, and culturally speaking, the uniqueness about the people in Singapore is they're actually more Chinese than the real Chinese. they're like hardcore Chinese because they're so detached from China for so many years, so they have to overcompensate. You know, the flower watching scene. This is the traditional Chinese literati would do. You know, to gather together. You know, this is a cultural event. You know, all the music. You know, so they have to overcompensate that to cast themselves as the social elite. Those are activities they do spend so much money on doing it, and it's a form of self-cultivation. So.
I think there's effort made in the film to have some markers. So like those, I don't know what they're called, lions that are spouting water, that's specifically Singaporean. Then the skyline is the Singapore skyline. But beyond that, it's not like a city comedy like Sex and the City, the TV show, right? And instead it's about Singapore as this cosmopolitan space which rivals spaces like New York or Dubai, etc. And I think that's the importance. And anytime they go to a new place, it's marked as like those big letters across the screen, like Shanghai, etc., or just international waters, right?
Yeah.
It's just international waters and nothing else. And I laughed out loud at that in the movie. So I think there's something very much at stake in the way in which, like you talked about Friends, like this is not New York City. So yeah, a lot of it is shot in sets, right? But the ways in which Singapore becomes real is through some of those visual markers, and then through food, through people, through languages, through just the faces and the Asianness or pan-Asianness or whatever, however problematic that might be. But I think that's one of the powers of the film.
And also settler colonialism, right? It's long history.
And sorry, like what you were saying about, so there's been this brain drain in terms of like people from China and India, like Asia, studying and then coming to these Western spaces, and they are made to stay here. And then there's all of this stuff, you people are taking away our jobs. And here there are people who will go to places like Cambridge and then they're like, like Oxford, and they're like, oh yeah, you're below us. And then they're going to go back, but they are contributing to their own economy. And I think there's a shift in that kind of thinking. Of course, it's like filthy rich people. So.
For a movie, we're making it do so much work.
I know.
Be all things for all people, all the time.
Exactly.
Okay, well, one final comment, and then we'll wrap it up.
Oh, yeah.
No, take your time, please.
Oh, okay. So I don't need to go in the same direction as this gentleman's question, but I was just wondering whether it's valid to criticize this movie at this point, because the movie finished, because that's something that should be questioned. But I just mean like, this is a movie we've been waiting for a long time for. Is it sort of right to like criticize it when we've only just gotten our foot in the door? I mean, to me, the parallel is sort of like the LGBT community in Ellen. When Ellen first came out, it wasn't the greatest show. I'll be honest, it wasn't the greatest show. But now we've evolved. Ellen was the way we gave people got their foot in the door, and then we moved to more progressive programming. I understand that there's good criticisms to be made, but is it valid to do it at this avenue?
Yes. I think very much yes. Because when you think about who's represented in the film and who isn't represented in the film, Asian diasporas are among the largest in the world. There are Chinese people everywhere. And I think that in terms of, do we have, is it okay for us to ask for more right now? Should we wait? No, we should be demanding, I think, our time. I'm a little aggressive. But I think that it's totally appropriate for any person, any community that has experienced any type of marginalization to demand to be heard, to demand to be represented in the many myriad ways in which they can and should be represented. So we're here saying this movie is great, but it's very problematic, and that's okay. I think it's important for us to be critical so that we know in which directions as a society, as art makers, as placemakers, we can and should be moving. Our time is here.
And now also from a business perspective, I'm teaching a business history course this semester. They want to sell, right? So the more critiques they got, the more talk it is. So there will be a sequel. so critiques are always welcome.
And speaking as somebody who's just a movie junkie, and I mean, I don't know if you noticed the contrast of what I spoke of during my introduction versus the rest of the panel. I wasn't as critical. I'm not saying that I did notice these things. I did notice the things that were brought up, and I've had, again, discussions with a lot of members of the panel about it, and I think I mentioned earlier that I found myself always defending the movie. Because, and this is something that Amanda and I talked about one day, was that I'm from a different generation. When Joy Luck Club came out, I was just out of high school, and it was huge, right? But that movie doesn't speak to me the way this movie does, because Joy Luck Club for me was, okay, there's Asian American women, but the bigger part of that movie was about the historical flashbacks that the mothers went through. So it didn't connect to me the way, in representing me the way this movie does, oddly enough. Even though I'm correct, I could probably be Nick's mother technically age-wise, but what I think is great though is that their generation is critical. Because me, I'm really happy. And again, but I didn't bring these things up until I hear, Amanda and Jean talk about it, and I'm like, oh yeah, now I have ways to discuss it. And that's another thing that's what's great about it, is that we are having these discussions, and I'm now speaking to a generation that is demanding more. Not to say that I won't, but I am from a generation who's extremely happy right now that we get to see this. But I'm sure my parents, the generation before me too, because how many times have you questioned why your parents are just okay with something, right? I'm okay with this for now, but the next generation is gonna push further, so.
I mean, I do think it's important to have space for pleasure, and I always get a little bit annoyed at the person who sees it and prints their hot take 5 minutes out of the theater and craps all over something. I'm like, give it room. First of all, see it at least twice, if not 5 times.
You don't have to see
it. But it's let people have their enjoyment, and acknowledge that for a lot of people this is, very, really important. That said, I do think it's really important to have the conversations, not the least of which is because, as we know, Hollywood, for all the money it has, is incredibly conservative and self-replicating, right? So we are going to get 2 sequels that do exactly the same thing if there isn't more pushback about hey, wouldn't it be great if we got a little bit more about sort of the working class, who also exist in Singapore. And so I think again, the more kind of discussion there is to just sort of derail before you have the whatever, it takes 17 Marvel films before the Black Panther, right? The faster you can make an intervention, perhaps the faster you can change kind of the Hollywood sort of machine.
And it's good to be able to do both.
Yeah.
I am in that space of doing both, and it's fine to sit with that, not deciding what to do or.
I think the conversation should be yes and instead of yes but.
Right.
I don't think any of us up here, and probably any of us in this room, would argue for the film to not have been made. I think all of us are glad the film was made, precisely because then it put to the fore all of these kinds of issues, that these, again, massively consumed cultural productions, need to be mindful of, right? And it has to do with ethics and aesthetics of the choices that are made by the viewer and the producers. So, it's all good. And this is taking a line out of the playbook of Huang and your colleague in screen studies. All conflict, in responses to cultural products are good for the industry. That's what they want because it allows them to rationalize, the sequel. So hopefully in that sequel, yes, like Nadine says, the studios are paying attention to all of the think pieces out there. And then secondly, we will achieve some kind of narrative plenitude. There wouldn't only be this one text that bears all of the burdens of representational responsibility, but that there'll be a lot more. Right. And finally, I'll just say, there's another film that stars an all-Asian cast no one ever talks about, and that is Justin Lin's Better Luck Tomorrow. That is an excellent film, and it spoke to me much more than this film or Joy Luck Club. Better Luck Tomorrow, Justin Lin, who incidentally directed Fast and Furious, and also Star Trek Beyond. And here's another Asian American director who is routinely not named. When they talk about Star Trek Beyond, they'll say it is J.J. Abrams' film. They won't say it's Justin Lin's film. So go see Better Luck Tomorrow. Okay? All right, thank you.